there's an approach to psychology that's become reasonably popular in recent years. And I'm only going to give you a very, very oversimplified version of it, so I apologize. But the idea here is what's called evolutionary psychology. The basic approach of evolutionary psychology is to say that, if there are traits that every human being has, if there are psychological traits that every human being has, then it's a reasonable assumption that they are there because they evolve. They're not a product of culture. There's something that's hardwired into us. And the time frame during which psychological traits probably got hardwired into the human species are between 100,000 years ago and 2.5 million years ago, when we're living in these small hunter-gatherer groups. So the hypothesis basically that evolutionary psychologists are working with, is the idea that during this time period when we were living in these very small hunter-gatherer groups, the mind evolved certain modules. And those modules were, basically those modules became fixed. The alleles for those modules became fixed in these populations because those modules were good at dealing with certain situations that Pleistocene hunter-gatherers frequently encountered. Well, we fast forward to the present day, and the idea is that when we encounter situations in our daily lives, the modules that evolved back in the Pleistocene are the modules that we have and use to deal with these modern situations, and that's why we behave the way that we do. So, for example, one of the modules that has been suggested is that human beings should have a module for detecting cheating. And this is one of these things that if most of your fitness comes from successful interactions with other members of your group, you better be able to pick up on when other individuals are trying to cheat you. This is something that you better be very good at if the social and political world are basically going to determine whether or not you pass on your genes. And this is true in a lot of primate groups. And there is some evidence to back this up, for example. So there are certain logic puzzles that psychologists have given to people, and the logic puzzle can be exactly the same, but if you phrase it differently, more people will get it right or more people will get it wrong. And in particular, if you ask the question, if you pose the puzzle in a way so that it involves cheating, okay, so if you pose the puzzle so that what the puzzle solver is supposed to be doing is detecting someone trying to cheat, they will get the puzzle right much more often than if you hand them the puzzle in a different neutral context that doesn't involve cheating. And what evolutionary psychologists have suggested is that this is evidence that when it comes to cheating, we are actually hardwired to be good at detecting it. Okay. Now I think there is a lot to be said for this approach, for realizing that human behavior, human psychology, or at least sort of the actual hardwiring, the form of the brain, and a lot of the ways it works, that is a result of our evolutionary history. There are things in there that are hardwired, and they were hardwired in a certain context, which is not the same as the modern context. And it seems only sensible to take that into account when you're thinking about how human beings think. The tricky part about a lot of evolutionary psychology, and there's some people who do evolutionary psychology well, but there are a lot of people who have done it badly and they've gotten a lot of criticism, is that it's really easy to look at a behavior that you see today and say, oh wow, that must have evolved for this reason in this setting, and then just kind of go on smugly feeling as though you've solved that problem. Usually, when there is a human behavior involved, there are many different possible explanations for it. Some of them obvious, some of them less obvious. And before you say that, oh yes, we understand why people behave this way or that way, you really have to put your hypotheses to the test. This is basically coming back to what I said at the very beginning of this lecture about people trying to use evolution to prove which race of human beings is superior to which. You have to be very careful when you try to bring scientific evidence to bear on something that you're really looking at the evidence objectively and not just seeing things that back up the assumptions that you already made. And this leads us to one of the more controversial topics when it comes to human beings, and a topic that you have just recently been studying, namely sexual selection. There are a lot of bad advertisements out there, and this is one of them. If you read and trust all of the emails that you get, you'll hear all sorts of things about how you can buy pheromones that will cause individuals of the opposite sex to be wildly attracted to you. And in fact, there are a lot of organisms that are, their mating behavior is triggered by pheromones that are released from the opposite sex. I'm sorry, it's not that simple in human beings. But there are some very interesting things about the reproductive behavior of human beings that maybe can be explained by referring to some of the contexts, some of the concepts that you've learned with respect to sexual selection in this course. There are some ways in which the way that we choose partners are mediated by chemical smells of some kind, even though we're not particularly aware of them. Human beings tend to partner with individuals that are different from them with respect to certain loci that determine your ability to fight off diseases or pathogens. And the reason for this, apparently, is that individuals with lots of different alleles at these loci, which are called the MHC loci, are able to detect and fight off more harmful pathogens or parasites. Individuals that are homozygous at a lot of these loci are going to be less well equipped to detect invaders that are trying to get into their body. And so as a result, this is true in many, many different species. Human beings have apparently evolved to seek out mates that have different MHC alleles from their own. And this has been shown in a lot of experiments, some of them very strange, but they've added up to a large body of evidence. In addition, in human beings, there may be a system that works very much like the peacock's tail, the handicap, that is sexually attractive to the opposite sex. In males and male humans, testosterone is a hormone that mediates secondary sex characteristics. And testosterone has the function of suppressing the immune system. And one hypothesis is that the reason that the traits, the secondary sex characteristics that are caused by high levels of testosterone are attractive to females is because only a male with really good genes could afford to suppress his immune system so much. In other words, the secondary sex characteristics that are displayed by individuals with lots of testosterone are an honest advertisement that he will be able to pass on good genes to a female's offspring. There is also some evidence that human mate preferences match what you'd expect if you had an understanding of sexual selection. So, for example, it is true that females tend to emphasize the earning potential of a mate more than males do. Okay, and this is similar to the behavior that we see in some other species, like, say, this house finch. Females choose male house finches based largely on whether or not the male seems like he's going to be able to provide for her offspring. Males, on the other hand, in our species, seem to prefer partners who are younger and therefore are maybe able to have more offspring. So, for example, the dating site OkCupid has gathered a tremendous amount of data on basically who contacts who. And of course, this really probably isn't a surprise, but males tend to reach out to females that are a lot younger than they are, whereas females tend to reach out to males that are slightly older than their age. It also seems to be true, at least in many cultures, that males are concerned about fidelity, about sexual fidelity. And basically the threat to a male, and if you're thinking about partnerships from the perspective of sexual selection, the threat to a male is that he will end up investing effort, raising offspring that aren't actually his. And so it's a great threat to a male if he is concerned that his partner is maybe having their offspring sired by someone else. In contrast, with females, the great threat is that a male will abandon her and her offspring. And so with females, often, you would expect to see patterns where what the female is concerned about is abandonment or emotional separation. And generally, when you talk to males and females about what they fear in a relationship, you get a pattern that's much like this. So there is a tremendous amount of evidence that looks like reproductive behavior in human beings kind of reflects all these things that we've been learning about sexual selection. But for each one of these patterns that I've pointed out, there's also really compelling evidence pointing in the opposite direction. So be very careful. I think there are some very interesting things about the way that human beings choose partners. There are some ways in which it seems to be similar to the patterns that we see in other species that are driven by sexual selection. But the jury's still out on, I think, all of these. And you want to be very careful before you start responding to those email ads about pheromones. In a less controversial area, there are many, many cases in which human beings have definitely become adapted to particular circumstances. And if you look at people groups who are living in different parts of the globe and facing different environmental challenges, you'll often find that natural selection has shaped that group so they can meet that particular challenge. So for example, for people that live at high elevation in the Himalayas or in the Andes, there are a number of different traits that they have evolved separately to deal with the stresses of being at high altitude, in particular to deal with low oxygen concentrations. Something that is more obvious to the eye is the differences in skin color that we see between different races. And this largely seems to be an adaptation to the difficulty of getting vitamin D at high latitude. Your body makes vitamin D, but you need to be getting sunlight in order to get it. And so at high latitudes, most people with dark skin actually cannot get enough sunlight throughout the year to make enough vitamin D. And so as a result, pale skin has been favored at high latitudes. At low latitudes near the equator, the risk of sunburn and cancer is high if you have pale skin, and you don't need to have pale skin to get enough vitamin D. And it's one of the major reasons why different people on the planet Earth have different looking skin. More recently, we've discovered genes that have to do with diseases that are very powerful selective agents in certain areas. Malaria is one of these diseases, and probably the best known example of a genetic adaptation to malaria is the sickle cell allele. We've talked about quite a bit in this class. Actually, there are a great number of genetic traits, often blood disorders, that seem to be in higher frequencies in areas of the world where there is malaria, because all of them seem to work in more or less the same way. They interfere with the malarial parasite that inhabits blood cells, and so even though they have some bad side effects for people, they've been selected for in areas where there's lots of malaria. The same thing is true, by the way, for a lot of diseases that seem to have come through Europe particularly when it was first highly populated and you had lots and lots of people living in close proximity. There are a number of alleles, including some genetic diseases, among European populations that seem to have been adaptations to one or more of these chronic diseases.